Welcome to this debate, ladies and gentlemen, on the merits or otherwise of modern architecture. I think most of you, probably because I've seen some of you here before, know what the rules are of the evening, but just in case you don't, I'll explain. We use normal debating rules, and the motion tonight is, as I said, on the merits or otherwise of modern architecture, whether modern architecture is a series of great erections to the egos of even greater architects, or whether they're emblems of the enormous creativity of our culture, or perhaps they're both. Our first speaker this evening is Roger Scruton. He's a philosopher, public commentator. He's currently a research professor for the Institute of Psychological Sciences, and he teaches philosophy at their graduate school in both Washington and Oxford. He's well known as a conservative thinker and a very powerful polemicist, and lots of other things. And I know you go hunting as well, Roger, and you love the countryside. Lots of other things I could say about you, but most of you have got the notes. Roger Scruton. Just to read for you, the topic for debate is Prince Charles was right, modern architecture is still all glass stumps and carbuncles.
It would be foolish to deny that there are beautiful modern buildings, whether secular like the houses of Frank Lloyd Wright, or sacred like the chapels at Enchant and Vence. The debate, however, concerns the rule, not the exceptions. The complaint issued against modern architecture by the Prince of Wales and many others concerns the ordinary buildings which have recently sprung up in our towns, which seem designed not to fit in, but to stand out. The modern office block, apartment house, or public building is not made for the city, but against it, like the spiral proposed by Libeskind for the V&A, which you see on the screen. Architects have become careless of the city and its inhabitants, more concerned to draw attention to themselves and their creations than to fit modestly into their surroundings as good manners demand. And the result is seen by the rest of us as a threat, comparable to loud-mouthed insolence on the buses or drunken puking in the street. Discussion of this issue should begin, I think, from common sense principles, and I'll suggest three of them. The first is that we build in order to dwell, and to dwell is to dwell among neighbours who have as great an interest in how we build as we have ourselves. A town is a home where strangers settle side by side and enjoy a shared sense of belonging. Its streets are public spaces, and the facades of its buildings stand in a personal relation to all who pass them by. The second principle is that genius is as rare among architects as it is among the rest of us. Most buildings will be the creation of talentless people who are simply doing a job like you and me. The less they try to be original and expressive, the better. To pretend to these qualities in their absence is to jettison the three most important social virtues, which are modesty, humility, and the ability to act as though others are more important than yourself. Most of our beautiful towns were not the work of architects, but of modest builders, working with materials that they understood and on a scale that does not challenge our perceptions. The third principle follows. Buildings should fit together in a public space that is accessible and friendly to all of us. This is most easily achieved if there is a shared repertoire of details, materials that blend and do not come apart visually at the joints, and proportions that can be emulated by each new addition to the townscape. And here, I hope, is an example of what I mean. I apologize for the slides, I'm an amateur. This is a simple street in Whitby, executed in the vernacular classical idiom, which was the common property of builders from the late 17th century until the time when modernist effrontery swept it away. Nobody knows who built these houses, and nobody cares. They were put up at different times for different purposes, using the local brick and with parts made to order by local carpenters and timber merchants. They are not great works of art, but there is a restfulness, a day-to-day gentleness of manners, which make it a pleasure to walk beside them. This is a welcoming street. The windows and doors, being taken from pattern books, harmonize with each other. The gutters and downpipes make a pleasant fugue from house to house, and the sky is not punctured and scratched as it is by the junk that is piled up on so many modern buildings, but it spreads like a canopy from roof to roof and chimney to chimney. You see a street light attached to the wall of one of the houses. It is expressed in the same classical language as the houses. It is not an excrescence, but a solid piece of street furniture, emphasizing the emotional reality of this street as both a public space and a home. These houses are not overtly classical. There are no Palladian windows, no pilasters or cornices, just the faintest hint of an order in the unobtrusive string courses which make such a pleasing contrast with the slope of the street. They hint at a kind of beauty which they neither achieve nor attempt, like a note struck on a piano in which all the harmonics of the triad can be faintly heard. And here, by way of contrast, is a street in Bristol, on one side of which is a row of buildings in the classical vernacular style, on the other side a collection of buildings in the modernist vernacular, using curtain walls of glass and laminated panelling. The detailing on the left-hand side of the street, where it exists, is visual nonsense. The surfaces have no perceivable relation to the structure, which is hidden behind them. The buildings have no posture and no real relation to the passer-by. They abut against each other arbitrarily, like aggressive people jostling in a crowd. They stick out at will and without visual reason. There is a kind of grammarless chaos here, of a kind that can be witnessed everywhere in our towns. Now, I envisage the response that I'm demanding too much. After all, these buildings are designed as offices. They have a specific use, which dictates their shape, and all that we see is the outer shell of a space that in itself is perfectly adapted to its purpose. But there is an obvious reply to that. The houses on the right are also offices. They were designed as private houses, but because they are so well-mannered, the residents of Bristol campaigned for their preservation. And they serve their new purpose perfectly, just as they would serve any purpose in which civility is needed. The buildings on the left, by contrast, could never serve any purpose but that for which they were built. And that purpose they will fulfill badly, precisely because those condemned to work in them will never be able to regard them as a home. It is inconceivable that anyone should wish to convert one of them to private apartments, a university, or a church. They will continue to be offices until the day, not very long hence, when they will have to be demolished at great financial and environmental cost. By that time, the houses on the right will have found another use, as a school perhaps, or a theatre. Here is the only cheerful aspect of modern architecture. Okay, let me emphasize that I'm not talking about the masterpieces. I'm talking about ordinary buildings in our cities. And I'm saying that the modern archetypes, which are designed at a computer and very often look like one, show no respect for their surroundings. They jut into the fabric of the town, often destroying the line of the street or making violent assaults on the skyline. All too often, the effect is of an assemblage of modern buildings in a city is like this vignette of modern Amsterdam, taken at random on a recent visit. The piece of railway architecture in the foreground does not stand as a building stands. It's like a plastic gadget washed up between two unsightly blocks of concrete, a kind of symbolic representation of the rubbish that can be neither recycled nor composted, but which will remain forever as a sign of how our generation of wastrels has trashed the planet. By contrast, here is a Victorian railway building, once a siding shed at Rochford. People have liked it and therefore kept it, and it is now a restaurant and conference centre. This is a symbol not of waste, but of the careful husbandry of resources, a long-term and cheerful settlement of the land, not for this generation or this moment, but forever. And that forever is written in the arches and mouldings which belong to the ageless language of design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for getting us off to such a very good start. Now, the first speaker against the motion is Stephen Bailey, who is perhaps one of the best-known authorities on design, architecture, popular culture and taste. And he was educated, luckily for him, at Manchester University. In the 80s, of course, he set up the Boiler House project with Terence Conran, and they put on many imaginative exhibitions there. As Clive James has said of him, he has the knack of getting ahead of everybody with values that turn out to be permanent. Stephen Bailey.
Thank you. Thank you, and good evening. Well, you can, as the Prince of Wales is reputed to do, talk to plants, but it's always a bit of a one-sided conversation because they tend not to talk back. I think the scope of inquiry with a rose or a potato is relatively limited. But buildings, on the other hand, I think are much more sophisticated, subtle, and multi-layered. With buildings, conversations evolve over time, and the tone of these conversations changes according to weather and experience. You can interrogate a building, and sometimes they interrogate you back. Anyway, we're all very grateful to the Prince of Wales, certainly for his thoughts on gardening and farming, but I genuinely believe that his simplistic, hierarchical, single-path criticism of modern architects and modern architecture has done no one any good. I mean, one example from his intrusion in the so-called debate is the puerile name-calling, which began with Carbuncles and Stumps. This catchpenny glib nursery culture has caught on and now masquerades as architectural criticism. Large new buildings are reduced to a crude morphological metaphor, so you have walkie-talkies and cheese graters and gherkins and so on. Should anybody be really surprised that after this most influential of architecture critics brands complex structures with shapely insults, that so many architects have responded by delivering a succession of shallow one-liners? It's like when your wife calls you a lousy, two-timing, no-good, ne'er-do-well. There's very little to prevent you being so. But anyway, the point is, the motion, let's get back to the motion. What Roger Scruton said was interesting and articulate, but actually avoided the subject we're here to discuss. The motion is that modern architecture is all glass stumps and carbuncles. That's manifestly not the case. So the actual proposal can be immediately disposed of. There are superb examples of modern architecture, nothing of the sort. Le Corbusier, of course, Hans Scharoun's classic Berlin, concert hall, just to give another example. More recently, some fine housing in Cambridge by Field and Clegg Bradley. There's lots of it. Even the so often demonized Le Corbusier hardly ever made a glass stump, and when he did, it's universally admired, like the handsome United Nations in New York. But anyway, Roger Scruton so helpfully conceded that there was some talent in Corb. But let's be clear, I think, that the actual wording of the motion disguises the real debate. The real subject here is hatred of novelty and experimentation. The real beliefs of the proposers are that culture is stagnant, even dead. And of course, that's the way they prefer it. Excellence, they believe, only can exist in the past. What a dreadfully depressing psychology it is to be so fearful of the future and so dismissive of the present. This is what the Prince of Wales has given us: silly metaphors and a distrust of creativity. Of course, no one but a fool would deny that lots of utterly atrocious modern buildings have been made in the past century. But so too were lots of atrocious buildings made in other centuries. But they've been lost, and it's the phenomenon known as survival bias that muddles the Prince of Wales's view of history. And besides, none of the historic buildings so admired by the gang that's going to save us from the future, none of these actual builders, the jobbing builders to whom Roger Scruton referred, none of them would recognize the timorous conservatism suggested by this motion. What then are the Prince of Wales's own credentials? Well, the original Carbuncles feature 25 years ago led to the current National Gallery extension, for one example, a design as vacuous as it is pretentious, and one not at all well adapted to its purpose. Another example, and I hope it's not sort of lèse-majesté to disclose a personal anecdote, but 20 years ago, as Anna Ford said, I was busy finishing off London's Design Museum. We went to the Prince of Wales to ask him to open it. I gave what I thought was a reasonably eloquent account of the importance of design to the economy and to the culture, about national purpose. The Prince of Wales, these larger issues interested him not at all. He just looked at me dolefully and he said, "Mr. Bailey, why has it got a flat roof?" There wasn't, I think, a scintilla of intellectual inquiry or architectural knowledge. And then, of course, there is, talking of that, Poundbury. To continue the literary theme with which I began, Poundbury is doggerel and pastiche. It's uninspired, craven, and derivative. It is sham, fake, and bogus. Now, we don't like these qualities much in writing or in people. Why would we admire these things in buildings and townscape? And what, too, of the inconsistent anachronisms in the Prince of Wales's arguments? One notes that His Royal Highness does not visit Dorset in 18th century helicopters. metopes, guttae, and triglyphs are all very well, for those who want them. But we make buildings with different building technology today. And besides, no one speaks Attic Greek anymore. The best truth I know about architecture is that you don't finish a building, you start it. And the same goes for towns. And if Poundbury is anything to go by, the Prince of Wales is not right. He is very, very wrong. The assumption in the design of the Prince of Wales's pet architectural project is that architecture is finished. We all know everything we need to know. And all we need to do, as Roger Scruton suggested, is copy the past. And frankly, it gets copied in a rather illiterate fashion. The architectural future, as seen by the proposers of this motion, is not to be carbuncles and stumps, but it's going to be fakes and forgeries. Anyway, thank you. But my real concern with the Prince's negativism and the negativism inherent in the motion is that wanting to make things new and better is, I believe, a defining characteristic of civilization. The proposers in this motion represent the first moment in history when thoughtful men hid in the past. I guess they've all read Lampedusa's great novel, The Leopard, where the hero looks out of the rubble of his collapsing palazzo and he says, if you want things to stay the same, they're going to have to change. Such a pity that they don't recognize the profound truth in this. Modern architecture, as I say, is manifestly not all carbuncles and stumps. It's not even a style, it's an attitude. It's a belief in making the most of contemporary possibilities. It's not about destroying history. Instead, it learns from the past, but has the confidence not to ape it. No one denies, least of all not me, that there are very many very bad modern buildings. But they're bad because they're bad. They're not bad because they're new. The Prince of Wales is absolutely right to condemn poor design, but he's wrong to condemn modern architecture. To do so is to condemn the creative spirit, and I, therefore, oppose the motion. Thank you.
Well, I wonder how you voted when you came in and whether you're wavering already. Our next speaker for the motion is Simon Jenkins, who's an author and a journalist. Of course, he's edited The Times and the Evening Standard. He's written numerous books, one of them on the architecture of London and the development of London, and others on England's 1,000 best churches and England's 1,000 best houses. Simon.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, for your splendid speech. It's the first time I felt I ought to impose a listed building order on a speech. Paper abuse. We've been very restrained on our side of the House this evening. I haven't got any slides. I did think mischievously of getting a photographer to go out and photograph all the buildings in which the opponents of this motion have lived and moved and had their being throughout their lives, but it would have been expensive, and I'm sure that they're very true to their principles, and they all live in concrete blighted stumps somewhere off the East India Dock Road, where some Corbusian from the Association of Architects felt it would be good for the working classes to live. The essential point I want to make this evening is that the architecture which I think we're discussing has always been unpopular. We are discussing modern architecture, in my view, not with a capital M, with a small m, but with a capital M. It's the style of architecture which evolved between the wars in Germany out of the abstract minimalist movement, and was characterized by a rejection of all forms of style, and has proved remarkably vigorous, at least within architectural schools and the architecture profession itself, but remarkably unvigorous among those people who choose their own places to live and work. If you go out along the Great West Road, you'll see the works of the interwar Ideal Home exhibition, neo-Tudor suburbs, neo-Georgian suburbs, neo-Queen Anne suburbs. But there's a wonderful moment somewhere in East Acton, for connoisseurs of these subjects, where you'll see a row, actually facing the road out to the airport, of about 4 neo-Bauhaus structures, clearly the result of some bright spark coming back to the New Ideal Homes Association, I think they were called, and suggesting that maybe this year we could break away from Neo-Tudor, Neo-Georgian, and Neo-Queen Anne and put up something made of pre-stressed concrete or render with a flat roof, no nonsense about a porch, and metal windows. It was abundantly clear that as soon as anyone from the public saw this structure, they said, but the flat roof will leak, we need a porch to stop the draft getting in, and metal windows rust. Not a single one of them sold, and the evidence of that is, if you look at them, that every one of them has now got a huge Queen Anne roof plonked on top of it, looking absolutely ludicrous, but presumably in order to get it to sell. There are only, in my view, two groups of people who've taken to the modern movement. One is public sector housing since the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because those people who were ordering public sector housing knew for sure they wouldn't have to live in it, and formed a peculiar and, in my view, pernicious alliance with the products of the architectural academies at the time, to build in the style that Le Corbusier and others, who is, I think, rightly castigated as the progenitor of most of this movement, to produce a utopian new society which would, in a sense, be social engineering through architecture. Now, I won't go over the products of their endeavors. They are being demolished all over the world. They were particularly prominent in Eastern Europe for obvious reasons. Interestingly, when they were being demolished in Liverpool, under the militant tendency of all people, the militant tendency, despite their otherwise predispositions, did actually ask the people of Liverpool where they'd like to live. The people of Liverpool, at least along Vauxhall Road, said they would like to live in the sorts of places they used to live in before they were demolished. And they have reconstructed a sort of neo-Queen Anne vernacular, which is extremely charming, is very popular, and is the absolute contrast with what the Liverpool Architects Department under Shankland had built in the 1960s and 70s. If you ask people where they want to live, they do not choose the modern movement. The other group who have proved very susceptible to the modern movement are essentially those people who build very large office blocks in city centres in the hope that they will thereby attract a tenant who wants an icon to his or her commercial prowess. Again, the motive here is ostentation, show, demonstrativeness, not utility or even popularity. The tall buildings that went up in London in the 70s and 80s and attracted Prince Charles's scorn, Centre Point, the Euston Tower, Stag Place, were essentially buildings fashioned by planners with architects in collusion in order to get profit out of busting the building code and build an underpass or a roundabout supposedly to benefit the public. They were universally unpopular, and almost all of them had to be taken by the only employer that doesn't give a damn about its employees, the government. Interestingly, when the inhabitants of these buildings get rich and get to choose where to do their work, the hedge fund managers, the private equity capitalists moving out of the city, where do? They go to a nice Georgian house in Mayfair. They know what they really like, and I think we do too. Now, the outcome of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's authority. It's always authority that imposes modern architecture. It is not bottom-up demand that requires it. And I think there's a reason for this. Deep in our cultural DNA, there is a love of ornament. We like decoration. We like style. There is something about style, proportion, that appeals to us. We resonate with it. That is why wherever anybody builds a housing estate or even a commercial estate, they find that the people want the traditional motifs, the designs, the echoes of the past. And I find that extremely significant when I'm viewing the modern minimalist glass box or concrete stump architecture. It is simply not what we respond to. The Victorians understood this. The Victorians, knowing they were tearing apart their communities, their society, deliberately took refuge in the styles of the past. They did not build reproduction. They developed, they thought, they did variations on the styles of the past, but they built what I believe to be some of the greatest buildings in Britain, Victorian architecture. I don't agree with everything Prince Charles says, but on this thing, he was right. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.